Thanks very much, and thanks for gathering for this really important event. I'm going to just summarize three really simple ideas about where we are with the communications agenda, broadly written. One concerns the evidentiary basis for the communications from the last cycle, something that Andreas already spoke to. The second is to distinguish between goals we might aspire to for communication within the wording and the images of the actual reports and the broader enterprise of communications. So to start with the evidentiary basis for whether the communication is working or not, and we've heard lots of things and we've seen lots of analyses about whether reports are understandable, but we're also standing here approximately 1 month after a historic agreement in Paris where the agreement was unquestionably science-centered, got the science right, and really focused on the issues that the Ipcc highlighted. I would say from the perspective of where we are in the agenda of addressing the climate science, it's really hard to complain about the consequences of the actions that were at least explicitly based on the agenda of the report. So I think that we need to, at least in terms of conditioning our analysis on real evidence of where the world is, recognize the world's in a very different place than it was 2 months ago, and that, as far as I can tell, the science from the Ipcc played a very constructive role in getting us to where we are. And that doesn't mean it's perfect, but I would say we don't have evidence that the communications didn't work, that the conclusions are being misinterpreted, or that we've built up some kind of a pool of hostility about climate science. Second issue is what should be in the reports. And both Ho-Sung and Jonathan have already spoken to something that I think is the core of what should be in the reports, and it's the development of a deeply shared ownership between the scientific community and the world's governments. And the essence of that ownership is the plenary approval process, where there's a deep conversation about where we are with the science, what it means, and what level of confidence different kinds of conclusions can be expressed with. We need to make completely sure that we don't lose that shared ownership, and at least for me, as I think about places where we can make trade-offs between understandability and the depth of the shared ownership. That shared ownership is absolutely critical. It's the unique thing about the Ipcc, and it also is the thing that is in many ways most challenging to orchestrate in a way that works. Now, there are lots and lots of examples of statements that come out less clear than they should. Jim's example, I agree, is really, really difficult to understand. And I think a lot of what we're talking about within the structure of the reports is really based on the creativity and initiative of the author team to come up with ways of understanding government inputs, understanding issues that governments don't understand, and finding the words to capture those right. In many cases, that's really a challenge of the creativity and flexibility of the author team, and I certainly accept a lot of responsibility for being in situations where we weren't quick enough on our feet, or where we couldn't convince authors to really engage with the questions that countries are asking. But most of the issues with the clarity of communication have more to do with getting the shared ownership right in a spirit that really works for everybody. In the context of what's in the report, nobody's mentioned figures yet, and I think that we do have a tremendous opportunity to use graphical elements to communicate more effectively than we have before. And if you look across the spectrum of the AR5, you see some graphics that were made a real investment in communication, and many that I think didn't, and that sort of hid behind complexity. So there are lots of opportunities in graphics. But let me say there, throughout this spectrum of what should be in the reports and where the opportunities are, that a really big component of it is the creativity, the flexibility of the author teams. And I think one of the things that we need to do, the most important thing to do better in the future, is to make a much bigger investment in training author teams in order to be effective in this, in the crucible of the plenary approval session, which is about as intense as situations get. And then let me just make a couple of closing comments comments about the broader communication enterprise. And I think there are really two ideas that people should understand. The first is that climate science communication, gigantic enterprise, and IPCC has a unique role in that, but it would be a mistake to think that IPCC ought to be responsible for element of climate communication across the entire spectrum. IPCC adds this unique value from the shared ownership of the scientific community and the governments, and it should use that as a base for expanding a set of messages that contribute to a broader climate science communications, which is also going to be supported by individual research papers, by climate science assessments that are coming from cities, states, individual countries, and that are amplified by a wide range of other stakeholder groups, including NGOs. And then the final thought I want to leave you with is that the broader communication really needs to be understood as a process rather than a product that gets plopped down on the table. And I think that in the AR5, probably the most consequential thing we did in terms of the process of broader communication is make it clear that we wanted to have the conversation with media, that we explicitly engineered the interface with the broader world in a way that was welcoming rather than off-putting. And I think that if there was a single element that we mostly got right, it was turning the quarter toward a constructive engagement rather than a standoff arm type of engagement. Across all three of those areas, the recognition of the building success, the changes within the report, and the changes in the broader scientific enterprise, there's obviously a tremendous amount more that could be done. But I think we also want to recognize important successes and that we should be cautious about the appropriate role of the IPCC and the areas where the IPCC can most clearly add value.
Thank you, Chris. Next speaker is Leo Meyer. If you could please come on stage and get your microphone. Leo Meyer was the project leader for the synthesis report, and he has previously been the leader of TSU for Working Group 3, and I think he's been working in the IPCC system for, I don't know, 13 years or something?
15 years,
About
20
50,
years even.
20 years.
A long time.
Lots of experience.
I'm a dinosaur. Yeah.
Please.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. I want to share with you a couple of experiences that I had with the communication part of the synthesis report. As you may know, the mandate of the synthesis report is to write a report in non-technical language suitable for policymakers. To some extent we succeeded in that, but to some extent we did not, because the text is full with technical jargon, and that is quite understandable because the report has to be composed and has to be fully based on the existing working group reports, and you cannot deviate from those texts with all kind of other inventions of other words. But this is still quite a challenge to change that in future. I want to show you an example here, the first slide, which is a bit similar to what Jim Ski said. This sentence, you can just quickly read it. It is a construction of a lot of information from Working Group 2 and 3 from many, many chapters that had to be condensed in a so-called headline statement. Now, the headline statement is a great invention and worked very well for Working Group 1, but it did not really work for a combination of Working Group 2 and 3 in synthesizing information on adaptation, mitigation, technology, and finance. All extremely important issues, but basically it is a truism. It's a bland statement that says nothing. The authors are not to blame because they had to condense already condensed information in a balanced way and with appropriate language into one sentence. So my recommendation would be in future for headline statements, especially on complicated areas for Working Group 2 and 3, where you have many different disciplines, cultures, scales, background, not to summarize everything in one sentence, but select something that is new, something that sort of hits the imagination and conveys a clear message to different levels of policymakers. And I think that authors could very well use the help of science writers or journalists. I think these people should be brought in early in the process of writing. Of course, the authors have the last say on what they write, but I think they can learn a lot from science writers and journalists around. But they have to be integrated in the process, and that, of course, will have resource consequences. Another example, if we can have the next slide. This is one of the most complicated graphs from the synthesis report. And I had a very hard time in the many presentations that I gave to explain it. And even like Jim Ski with one sentence, I often thought, do I understand this really? And see this extremely long caption, you don't need to read it. Now, also here, the authors are not to blame because they have page length restrictions. So instead of long text, they use graphs, and they have to put a lot of information in one single graph in order to get all the information that is there in a balanced way into a report. And it communicates well to other scientists in the same field, and it does not communicate at all to a broader audience. So graphics need to be simple and just a few lines and a one-liner headline statement that conveys the key message that should be taken up in the caption as well. So that's the second recommendation. There's also an example, a very good example that worked well. Can I have the next slide? This one may be familiar to some of you, is a very clear, eye-opening message about the urgency of the problem that we are facing. This graph was actually not in the synthesis report itself. It has been constructed by very clever people based on information in the synthesis report. And this is the kind of examples that I think we should see more. I have to be brief because I have only 120 seconds. I may be already over it. The biggest challenge actually for communication will be the special report on pathways towards the 1.5 degrees, which is due in, say, mid-2018 or somewhere in 2018. So it's not 2021, and so there is also real urgency to implement communication recommendations in the Ipcc. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leo. Next speaker is Pauline Midgley, and she was communications director and international relations manager, were you? In working group 1 during the AR5 report.
Am I? Yeah. What I'm actually going to say is I'm the former head of the technical support unit of the working group formerly known as Working Group 1. And in that role, I also directed communications. Now, I think you can probably say that if I was a director of communications in an Ipcc technical support unit, it tells you what communications in Ipcc were like at the point at which I was recruited, which was 2009. When I was recruited, I was not told that I had to do anything with communications. Jonathan and many people in this room have taught me all that I know about communications, and I hope I'm not being too bold in saying that I believe that I've also taught them a lot about what communications within the Ipcc means, because it is a different organization. Now, Jonathan has stolen my thunder by explaining in which it's different, but I think we do have to reckon that we do have to come back to being the Ipcc being an intergovernmental panel and having the constraints of approved language, which is very intensively discussed in approval sessions. Coming a little bit later than other people into making the presentation, I can say most of what I wanted to say has already been said. Communication of uncertainty, I think, is one of the key things. This is particularly in a Working Group 1 context. We have, as physical scientists, the need to communicate that uncertainty, but how do we communicate that to others than ourselves? So I think that's something that needs to be looked at from a communications perspective. Looking back, I've now retired, more or less, but I come back to meetings which interest me, and this is one of them, and it's nice to be back in Oslo. So I can sort of, keep my grey hairs and sit back and say, now what did we learn over the last 7 years? And what I see is indeed a huge turnaround in communications from Ipcc, and I think we shouldn't be shy about it. I think Chris Field has said this, and I think I would stress this also from Working Group 1. We shouldn't be shy about how well the communications in AR5 worked. Yes, they can do better. You can always do better. But they maybe did as well as we could deliver with the resources that we had available to us. And I think I've also looked back at what Working Group 1 did in communications, and we started out recognizing that communications needed to be better than it had been. The panel was saying, well, yes, maybe, yes, we do need to do that. There started to be the ISC reviews about what the panel was going to do. The panel introduced its communication strategy in 2012. By that time, we were well along the track of producing the IPCC report. So in 2010, we put our heads together as to what we might do on communications, what could we do, what could we actually deliver. And so we tried to integrate communications in I don't think we knew what we were doing at the time, but now I sit back and see that's what we actually did. We integrated this into our process along the way. So Working Group 1, for instance, had a media briefing at all of its lead author meetings, at which it didn't talk about the report, it didn't talk about the content of the report, but it talked about something which nobody has mentioned today as a communications issue, which is explaining what IPCC is about. And I mean, it's amazing to me how few people understand that. So I think it's really important to explain what it is and why is it that the reports are not at that time publicly available. Maybe draft reports in the next cycle will be available, which I think they should be once you get to a certain stage. But it's important to explain that that's what we're doing. We're not being secretive, but it really helped to then start building that trust and building a cohort of media people who had some understanding of what we were doing. So what we did, and I'd like to stress this again, is that we try to integrate it in the process from an early stage at a level that we could deliver. And I think I do have to come back to that, because you have to recognize that apart from a few strange souls like those who go and work in the Secretariat or the TSU, virtually nobody is actually paid directly to work for IPCC. So we're really relying on the authors. And the more that people say, oh, well, IPCC could do this, that, and the other, if that's expecting the authors to do it, you're adding a burden which they possibly haven't signed on for. So I think actually making it clear what's expected from the start, which is why it's great this meeting is happening now, you can integrate thoughts about what's going to be done and who's going to be doing it. But as Chris said, it doesn't have to be done always by the author teams. It can be done by others, and indeed should be done by others in many respects, because what we have to also is what are the IPCC working groups doing? They're producing an assessment report. And if that means other people communicate about it, that may be what we want to do. Now, having said that, obviously people have mentioned the headline statements. I didn't burden my luggage with 1,500 pages of Working Group 1 report. I brought a sheet of paper. On this 2 sides of a sheet of paper, you can actually pull it out and have 4 headline statements instead of 19. You could even take one sentence. Human influence on the climate system is clear. Now, did we all understand that? I hope we did. However, I would like to point out that doesn't come from nowhere. And Melinda can confirm how many, probably not hours, but minutes we spent discussing whether we could say clear. Is that the right word? Is that a word we can use in an IPCC report? And this was discussed not with any communications experts around, I don't think, but basically saying we want to tell people what we know, and that's what we know, so can we use clear? And we said, well, we'll try it. Maybe the panel won't like it. To our great pride and pleasure, the panel did like it and thought that was fine. So I think that, again, the headline statements didn't come from nowhere, in the sense that it's something that was started when we started writing summaries of the summary for policymakers. When we had executive summaries, we pulled them out, we put them into one document and said, is this a narrative? Does it tell us anything? And then we tried to sort of reflect that back into the writing of the report. So there is a lot of effort involved, but it's obviously tended to be worthwhile. And I couldn't finish without just quickly referring to the frequently asked questions, which was an innovation that Working Group 1 did in AR4, and we carried on in AR5. It worked well for us. I think it worked well for Working Group 1 because it was integral to the process, and it was something that we actually wanted to do. It wasn't directed to us to do it that way. So I perhaps shouldn't have said that in public, but I forgot about the live stream at that point, but I'm now retired, so there's nobody on my back. So I can say, if it's something that you can, but it's what Chris said, you have to get that ownership. Get the ownership and it will work. Don't get the ownership and it will be difficult.
Thank you, Pauline. Thank you.
Took my glasses off. Took the wrong thing off. Thank you.
Next speaker, Yuba Secona, who was the co-chair of Working Group 3 on mitigation. And he Special Advisor on Sustainable Development at the South Center in Geneva. Now, while Yuba is doing his presentation, if you have questions or if you want to make comments, you can indicate that to me while Yuba is speaking. And I would especially encourage other AR5 authors who are in the room to make comments on this in this session. Thank you. Please, Yuba.
Good morning, and it's a pleasure to be again back at in Oslo, the same place, and then this is an inspiring building and then inspiring discussion. We had some of the working group 3 meetings here, and then they sent us a report. And communication became one of the important elements of the throughout the AR5 process. Maybe to complement what has been said, let me take we in the working group 3, the metaphor we use, it's map making and then navigators. And then this is all about the communication. If you want people, if you want the decision makers at different levels to navigate, you have to give to them a clear map. If the map is not clear, they cannot navigate, and that is clear. And this is how we use that metaphor throughout, and then we try also to use it in the throughout the assessment. And then one of the key elements is the structure of the report and its summaries. And then that is important, how you structure the report. And then bringing in the report the framing element, and then that will help us to have much more approach in the other chapters. And then we insisted also on internal communication, because as Jim said it, on the, it's a matter of language, some of the language we are using. Spend a lot of time discussing internally and then to share the same approach, the same concept, the same ideas in order to better communicate the different elements of the report. And then we also insisted on external communication. It's not only among the authors, but external. And it has also with the selection of the author themes, as the issues and the problem we are dealing with is not simple problem. And then you cannot translate some of those problems in very simple languages. It's a complex and complicated problem. And then that need to have a wide selection of the author has to come from a wider perspective in order to be able to capture all those different elements. And that is how, in contrast with the previous assessment report, we have new type of authors in the AR5, that is some figures, and then to bring some of those different elements. And in for the effective communication also, and then we have tried throughout the in the report, and then to bring to shape a series of plain and key messages in line with the available science. And then some were clear, some were a bit complicated, and then you also give some of the element that has been illustrated by Jim and Leo. And then what Leo proposed, this is a much more elaborated version of a much more complicated one. And at the first cut, that was one of the most elaborated in something that's complicated, and then that came up. And then we also build in-house communication capacity, because this is for the first time in the technical support units, specialists on communication on climate change has been recruited. And then in order to work with the author team, to work with the wider perspective, and then to bring also some of the element of communication. And then we also insist in developing a common and contemporary of Ipcc projects, and that has been throughout. And then most of all the figures has been done by professionals. It is not amateurs who did the figures. And then all the graph that has been produced throughout the report has been done by the professional graph designers, and then they provide some. And then we also insisted on the focus outreach plan. And then if you look at the outreach activities in a different part of the world, there were not the single outreach plan that has been developed. been adapted in local context, the local perspective, and then to insist on things that are important and priority for them. And then there is additional outreach material, and that has been also explained by Yuashri in the case of some specific countries. And then for across also the working group that has been translated in the non-UN official languages so that to make it much more accessible. And then lastly, the collaboration in the production of derivative products. And then it is not only the Ipcc authors help number of institutions who are interested in disseminating the finding of Ipcc to help them to shape the information. And those are briefly some of the elements. I just want to complement what has been said by the previous speakers on communication that became central important element of AR5. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuba. If you could stay, and if I could invite the other presenters back up on the stage here, and we can hear some comments from the audience. And I would, again, especially like to hear comments from AR5 authors. I have a question there. That was Lindsay, was it?
Lindsay, Quaker UN office. Forgive me, I wasn't an author, but I wanted to pick up on something that Chris said. You said that the Paris Agreement got the science right. And what we have is a global framework, but without legally binding targets on mitigation, finance, etc. So that's exactly the point we want to pick up on, is in many ways now the real work begins. And what I would encourage in the next 2 days is how do we get the message of urgency and limited time into this work, into the communication, because we have the global framework, but now how do we get people to act on it? And therefore, when we talk about reaching policymakers, if we pick up on what our colleague from Christian Aid said, a wider understanding of who are the policymakers, that it goes from the high to the low, to the global to the local, but that most of us are not scientists. And how do we get that message about the challenges before us, how bad they are, what we can do about them, what our choices will, how they will affect, and not to be afraid when we talk about some of these scary issues. So briefly, how do we make the message clear, as Pauline said, and personal, while still being in the Ipcc framework?
Okay. I think we'll just take a few more comments and then we can take a roundup here. Next question was at the end of the row.
Hi, Stuart Neal from the World Energy Council. I've heard, and it's sort of picking up a little bit, I've heard a number of people say we're writing it for policymakers. But I think you really need to think about what those policymakers are and what do they need. Because we've done some work in the energy space looking at what the energy ministers need, what the energy leaders, private sector need, and the finance sector. And they speak completely different languages, and their drivers are completely different in what they need and what they will motivate them to act upon your findings. So I think it's important to think maybe at the early stage and how you might do that, of who your policymaker is. And yes, we've heard it can be down at the very local level, and we're seeing in the energy space this emergence of the prosumer, you know, localizing the ownership of power creation, and that decision is very much down to the local level. So I think some thinking around that is important.
Thank you. And there is a question back there. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, and thank you the presenters. I'm Gabriel Blanco from Argentina, Universidad del Centro. Just a couple of comments on the content of our messages coming out. I was author in AR5 Group 3 with Yuba, so Yuba, it's nice to see you there. A couple of comments on the messages, the content of the messages that we are delivering, and my experience is in presenting the results of the Ipcc reports is that every time you start talking about this catastrophic future, I mean, people start looking start looking away from you. They don't want to hear that anymore, in my view. In particular, in our countries in Latin America, people are, you know, they have hassles to deal with in their daily lives. And every time you start, you know, talking about this catastrophic future, it's something that is paralyzing for people in many ways. So it seems to me that we need to start looking at the linkages between climate change and social, political, individual choices, decisions and actions that audiences can see more. They are more interested in that, and they can see closer to the solution to the problem. So perhaps in regarding content, I think we need to start looking at these kind of linkages between choices and decisions at all levels. So in that sense, I think someone mentioned that we need some additional expertise in our reports. I think we need a social scientist, we need anthropologists in our work, and we need to invite them to participate all along the process. We need to look again carefully about uncertainties. I think many people, media including, are using uncertainty against scientists, against science, to undermine our findings. So we need to look at that carefully. Many people mentioned that already. And a couple of suggestions from my side is that we need to include in our process from the beginning media, journalists, to understand our processes, to understand how the Ipcc works, so we can have them in our side in that sense. So, and at the same time create a sense of ownership among these people. And not only journalists, but also including filmmakers, artists, etc. So we need to have them from the beginning. And also have, Yuba mentioned that we had already in AR5 professional graphic designers, but that was for different purposes. We didn't from them. We just used them to put up a nice graphs, nice colors, but we didn't hear from them. So we need graphic designers also from the beginning, but to listen to them and see what they have to say about our product. So these are a couple of suggestions from my side on content and on the process and who kind of expertise we need in the next AR6. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we'll do just two short comments, and then the panel can respond. And I have Nick and sorry, Tim.
Thanks. Don't worry, everybody gets us mixed up. Even Nick calls me Nick. Tim Nuttall, no relation of Nick's. Completely spelled differently, different part of the country. I work at the European Climate Foundation, not at the UNFCCC. I wanted to pick up on a point that Pauline made. The learning that you had from the professional communicators who were involved in the AR5 process, and in turn the learning that they were able to draw from you and from the other scientists. For me, that's really important, and this meeting is a demonstration and a recognition, I think, of why it's important to bring the two groups together. A lot of time over the course of the AR5 cycle, it felt like we were pulling in different directions, but actually we're all working to the same end. We just come from very different disciplines. And it's important for us to get to know each other, to get to know what we each bring to the table, to develop that respect that can then lead to the levels of creativity that the institution needs. And also recognition, as somebody said before, about the boundary, I think it was Chris, the boundary to which the Ipcc can and should work, and the constraints that exist for the intergovernmental process, and then a recognition of what other institutions can then take and do to move onwards. I think many of that trust is really important, and came back to me again and again, because many of the communication successes that were achieved at AR5, the foundations of those were built after the challenges, the communications challenges of 2009, 2010, then the lead up through SREN and SREX, and baby steps were taken at each of those stages, but they bore fruit at the end of the AR5 process, and I think that's really important. And it feels to me that this meeting offers an opportunity to supercharge that development of trust between the two disciplines.
Thank you. And then one last question. Lady with the pink jacket.
I'm Joyshri.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what I wanted, just very quick, as a IPCC author, I would say that if I look through AR4, what we were mandated with to produce from the very beginning. So we knew we'll have to produce the report, we have to produce the technical summary, we have to produce the executive summary. That's it in AR4. In AR5, we got some more mandate. With all these three, we need to produce key messages, we need to produce frequently asked questions, we need to produce the knowledge gap. So those are good products which came up. I think what we did in AR5 for our working group 3, we got a mandate of producing headline statement pretty late. And we tried to work on those, but then given the time and all, we found that that's really not coming out well, which we would have really liked them to come out with. So I would say that with technical summary, with executive summary, with key messages, with frequently asked question, with knowledge gap, we need to add headline statement or some more communication materials which the authors can produce from the very beginning and mandated, and which Pauline has already mentioned how nicely they have done in Working Group 1. So with more mandates, I think authors can produce much better reports too.
Thank you. I'll let
From what we did before?
Sorry?
We'll just go in the opposite order, maybe?
We can go in the opposite order of what we did before,
I
so
can
that
start.
you can start. You already have a microphone.
No,
you probably won't be able to respond to all the comments, but you'll have to choose a few of them that you would like to
I will
respond to.
take, this kind of meeting is important because we think that we have to use one process to solve all the problems. And then we have to understand the mandate of IPCC and what can be done, what cannot be done. And then it's important to know also that in the whole process, in the beginning and in the end, there is a dialogue between IPCC and the policymakers, and then the decision makers. And then we selection of who will be those decision makers. All will depend on the country. The country can take as decision makers from the local to the national level. But we do have that conversation on the scoping, because the scoping is not only the author, the scientist. And then it's a co-production of what needs to be done by those who are using the assessment. This is very important. And it's important also that the summary for the policymaker is a co-product of the authors and then the government decision maker, those who are using the report. And then we do not select. We select the authors, but we do not select those who will be participating in those different meetings. And then so it's very difficult for us to see that to which decision makers are we communicating to. Is it at local level or at national level? All will depend on the composition of the country group that will come up. Because it is not only the authors who define the summary for policymakers, it is co-produced with those who are using the report. And that is why we spend nights and days on discussing. And those are some of the elements I just want to bring in that has been raised.
Thank you. Pauline?
Thank you. Just to pick up on the, is that on? Yeah. The comment that the lady at the back made, it occurred to me that one of the things that we haven't talked about is that the communication of AR5 hasn't stopped. It doesn't stop because there's now plans to make an AR6, because what there is for IPCC to communicate is indeed to delve into all the materials that's available in the AR5 and to use that as a foundation for discussing what it's planning to do for AR6 and also to give the backup to the Paris Agreement. And just whilst I have the microphone, there are just two quick things I wanted to, I did get to say in my 5 minutes. One thing was to make the point that the headline statements, what's important about them is that they are approved language, as Yuba has said. This is text which has been approved by the panel. So it's actually a much stronger message than something which is a derivative product that's produced afterwards. But both have their place. And also, on the frequently asked questions, one of the reasons, again, why I think those work quite well was because we did, in Working Group 1, did involve science writers at an early stage in the process. Not early enough probably for AR4, but much earlier for AR5, and I'm very happy to see that the person we involved is here, and I hope that at some point Dave can also talk about his experience about being a communicator who has given the task of working with the authors and how that dialogue works, because I think that's a very important point.
Thank you. Leo?
Thank you. Joshua Roy made a very important point about extra tasks for authors. I think whatever comes out of this meeting will mean more work for future IPCC authors. And it is indeed important that they are well aware of this when they are requested and selected to do the work. It's also important to have that very clear already at the level of the scoping meetings. Stakeholders where a long wish list will be generated that have to be produced, take into account all the things that have been said here. So, but with sufficient resources and preparations, I think many of the recommendations here could be accommodated. Thank you.
Thank you. And Chris, you get the final
I'm just going to say
remarks.
a couple of things. First, I'd like to continue the walk down history lane for just a couple of minutes and follow up on Tim's comments about the way that the engagement with communications professionals kind of unfolded a series of opportunities. And I think everybody remembers that a lot of the initial conversations were in the sort of the crucible of challenge in 2009, 2010, where the real core issues were whether the Ipcc was a vast international conspiracy, and that a lot of the investments that needed initially were in real crisis communications mode, and that was a really formative experience for the authors throughout the AR5 community, and especially in the executive team. And I think that really nailed down many of the relationships that then continued to grow and expand and allow us to do many of the more ambitious engagements that followed along. And then, of course, the introduction of a whole series of outreach exercises ranging from customized websites to embargoed discussions about SPMs, all the videos really unfolded. I should really give a lot of credit to the government of Norway, which really provided the funding for the initial investment in almost all of the things that have now become the key elements of the Ipcc communications plan. And I want to close with just one thought that goes to Lindsay's question about how we communicate next steps. And one thing that I've been struggling with, and feel like I have some special opportunities as a ex-IPCC official, is that over the next several years, we're not going to have a new IPCC report. Probably in the most critical period for climate communications ever, we don't have a new IPCC report. So what are we going to do? I mean, one thing we can do is we can say, yeah, here's what we said based on the literature in 2012. It's still pretty darn good, and we need to do that. But I think we need to think really, really hard about how, as a broader science community, and especially as ex-IPCC officials, we'll integrate the really dramatic progress that's been made on a wide range of questions with the foundational information that comes from the Ipcc. And especially for government representatives and for communications professionals, I think this challenge, that I call IPCC Plus, is going to be a really critical element of making progress in the next few years.
Thank you very much. Thank you to this panel. Applause.